will forever be a legend here at Tottenham. It's a massive club. Everything I do is for the long term.
And still Ricky Villa. What a fantastic run. He scored.
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, it's there.
Here's Lucas Moura. Oh, they've done it. The wait for silverware is over.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Tottenham Way. I'm Tom Barclay of The Sun. I'm joined by the other Tom Allnutt of The Times. And Tom, for once we have something to be positive about. Tottenham have A, won a game, and B, put themselves into a very, very healthy position in the Champions League. Once again, for the second season running, it feels like Europe may be the saviour of the season, albeit to go all the way in the Champions League would certainly trump going all the way in Europa League last season.
You never know, Tom. You never know.
You never know. You never know. I mean, there's a lot to get into over the performance, to luxuriate over, to be fair, after some of the negativity and the dismal performances for most of the season. And we'll get into it. But I just first off, how nice is it from a journalist perspective, as much as people presume are out, got the knives out a lot of the time, how nice is it to report on something positive and to have no boos in the stadium for once?
Yeah, it was really nice. It was really nice. I mean, even in the press conference afterwards, Tom, you were in the mix zone, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in the press conference afterwards, like, I feel like everyone was just quite enjoying the sort of the atmosphere in the room. It was like, isn't this lovely that we don't all have to sort of ask, like, really tense and awkward questions that are going to, make Frank feel awkward as well. Everyone was sort of saying before their question, which is, often routine, but I felt like everyone was sort of saying, congratulations, Thomas. And at the end, like, as he was walking out, I said to him, well done, Thomas. And he sort of looked at me and he sort of said, thank you, a really like big smile on his face. And I mean, I hope people, understand that we're not sort of, it's not because we're sort of light touch or anything on Thomas. It's not that. I think it's just that, you go through these weeks where you just sort of have 4 or 5 press conferences every week, and you're writing 1 or 2 reports, and when everything is sort of, you're right. I mean, there's no other word that it's negative, that you're basically criticizing and you're questioning a guy's future. And it was just really refreshing, I think, to be able to write positively, to have some positive individual performances, but also just for Frank, and I'm sure we'll get into his future and what it means or what it doesn't mean. But just for him to have a night like that, I thought was really nice. I mean, people can feel how they like to feel about him, but me personally, I felt really pleased for him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that every Tottenham fan, particularly the ones who go regularly and pay all that money, have every right to sort of feel how they feel about this season and how about the manager, and that's his responsibility. That's why he's paid a lot. That's the pressure that comes with being a Premier League manager. But just from our perspective, I mean, there probably are some journalists out there that enjoy asking tough questions and putting people in a difficult spot. I don't think either of us are one of them. We realise we have to, and I think we're both pretty good at it, to be fair. But when you deal with a person, whether it be Ange last year or
Thanks,
Thomas,
nice to on the podcast. Nice to give ourselves some praise here.
Yeah, it is. But when you deal with that, it's the human element, isn't it? When you deal with that person every week and you see the sort of strain they're being put under. And then also when you see at times comments they've made as part of an answer that get sort of picked apart and taken in isolation and sort of that winds fans up more, and you're kind of like, well, I don't know if it's quite fair. Was he really having that much of a pop? It's just kind of how it came out. And when you're dealing with the person,
you're talking about on social media where people,
yeah, a little bit. I'm not having a dig. To a certain extent, I just feel like here's an example. When a few weeks ago, it was an answer to one of my questions. He basically said, I'd like to see you guys or people on social media sort of see what it's like playing under the pressure that the players are under. But it wasn't as strong as that. And then when you read it did feel quite strong. But listening to him say it, yeah, he is kind of having a bit of a pop back saying, you see how you get on in this situation. But it was part of a fuller answer. And I kind of thought it was sort of fair enough. I mean, one of the things George has said consistently throughout this is fair play to Thomas for not snapping at some of our questions throughout this. And then I saw like that one line on social media, and obviously a lot of the fans sort of piled in. And there have been times when I thought, I just don't feel that's been quite fair. So anyway, that was partly why, it was nice to have a sort of positive story. I mean, first of all, just Champions League wise, as much as bad as it's going domestically, they're in an amazing position. As we speak, they're fourth in the league table. Obviously, there are games this evening, so they may drop down further, but a win at Frankfurt will definitely guarantee top 8. They may not even need all of that. Frankfurt at the moment still have something to play for. It sort of depends on how they get on this evening. I think if they lose, then actually it'll be a dead rubber for them in the final game. But they're in a whole bunch of turmoil at the moment. Sacked their manager recently, struggling for performance, for results. And obviously Spurs have got history of winning there in a massive game last year. I mean, also just one other stat that I wanted to point out was the fact that this is now 24 home games in Europe that Spurs are unbeaten, which is pretty incredible. I was quite surprised when I heard that from our colleague John Cross at the Mirror yesterday. But I suppose before we get into the performance, Sorry, carry on, Tom.
I was just going to say the contrast between Europe and domestic form for Tottenham is just, it's bizarre, isn't it, really? Like, I mean, that stat, that the 24 unbeaten at home, when you consider that all season, all year, we've been talking about how poor Tottenham have been at home. And I think it's 2 wins in 11 in the league at home, so that just, it's just completely different in the Premier League and away. And just in terms of the table, like, in the Premier League, they're 14th between Palace and Bournemouth. And in the Champions League, they're 4th between Bayern Munich and Paris Saint-Germain. Like, it's just 2 different teams, isn't it? And I think to some extent, obviously, you can explain it by the fact that, that long run of 24 games at home, it includes, let's be honest about it, some fairly middling opposition in the Europa League. To be frank, some fairly middling opposition this season in the Champions League. And I think it even goes as far back as the Conference League. Is that right?
It does. Yeah.
So
Leipzig,
not all of it is necessarily right. So it's not all of it is kind of top draw opposition, but still, it's amazing the kind of contrast between the domestic form and the European form.
It is, but having said that, whilst people said this is almost like a Europa League draw that Spurs have had in the Champions League this season, Borussia Dortmund are no mugs. I don't think there's a way. You can't play them down. They if it weren't for Harry Kane's amazing Bayern Munich season, they'd probably be top of the Bundesliga or close to it in most campaigns. They've only lost 1 game. And even though, obviously a lot of things didn't go for them last night, I actually thought they didn't perform particularly well. You can't sort of explain this away as like a Copenhagen at home. I think you've got to give Spurs full credit for it. I mean, do you want to come back onto Frank in a little bit? Maybe just talk about the performance, I guess. It felt like...
Stay with the positive.
Well, I mean, I don't know, they sort of tied in together on it. I suppose one of the things with Thomas this season is not a lot has gone for him, has it? I mean, obviously there have been injuries. Think of Fulham where Vicario doesn't clear it, and so it goes to Harry Wilson and he scored, like little moments like that, which haven't gone for him, albeit, that doesn't explain away some of the absolutely dreadful, particularly home performances and the lack of sort of ambition at time the team have shown. But I do think not a lot of it has gone for him, but it certainly did yesterday. I mean, we think of the 3 key incidents in the first half. Even the first goal, Wilson Odobert has a complete sort of miss hit, but it luckily sort of bounces for him that he can then get the cross in for Romero to put in a fantastic finish, really. Then obviously the Solanke goal where he couldn't hit it better, really, where it sort of hits his trailing leg. And then the red card as well, which I think most of us go, that shouldn't be a red card, but then nor should have Brennan Johnson's. And it's one of these incidents where it generally does feel like the apocryphal, stuff evens itself over across the season has actually happened in this incident. So it felt like everything kind of went for him, but also it was a fully deserved win as well, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think basically because, in that first 20 minutes before Dortmund had the red card, Tottenham already 1-0 up. Let's not forget that. And I think they were also playing really well in that first 20 minutes. It was even if we just take that as the kind of the true sample of the match, if you like, the 11v11, I think it was, Spurs were so on top. They really overwhelmed Dortmund in that first kind of period and they created good chances. and the crowd are really behind the team. And I'm trying to sort of remember the chronology, whether it was kind of the crowd behind the team and the players playing well, or whether it was the players playing well and then the crowd behind the team. But I think, to be honest, it was kind of both. I noted down in the 3rd minute that there was a real sort of, unified chant of "Come on, you Spurs." In the 20th minute was the first sort of, when the Spurs go marching in. It was both. I don't think it was just because the team were playing well that the fans were up. I think the fans did really well last night, actually, because I think there was probably quite a few fans who kind of thought, well, do we really want to, if we win this, it means we keep Frank, and I think there probably was a little bit of that in some fans who are really anti-Frank. But you didn't feel that at all. There was some boos, wasn't there, when his name was read out before kickoff. And we were saying, Tom, that we kind of felt Paul Coity, the stadium announcer, sort of tried his best to kind of smooth Frank through into the kind of squad, the lineup announcement, because normally he goes, led by the head coach, Thomas Frank, and everyone goes, yay, or not. But this time it was more like, led by the head coach, Thomas Frank, and the goalkeeper, Vicario. He tried to kind of just push that through. But there were some fans who, and I think it was a small minority who were quite determined to kind of get their boos in there. But actually, that was kind of it for the whole night. That was it, wasn't it? In the match, there was songs, there was great atmosphere. Obviously, no boos at half time because it was a really good first half performance. And at the end, I think it's fair to say as well that the fans were, applauding the players and Frank as well. Frank didn't necessarily go all the way over to the south stand, so maybe he didn't kind of make a really big thing of it. But everyone was clapping. It was a great atmosphere, and I think that really helped that first kind of 20 minutes. And I think you talk about the luck. I think it's true. Ultimately, I couldn't even describe Solanke. I watched Solanke's goal about 8 times on the replay, and I was like, what actually happened there? I can't really put that into words. I just can't see what went on. But he was in the right position, and I think a sharper Solanke just tucks that in. And there was another one, wasn't there, where Porro kind of crossed it and he didn't quite get there. Basically, I agree with you. I think they deserve their luck, and there's no doubt that Frank. He's mentioned this a few times, hasn't he, in his press conferences, that he feels that they haven't quite got the rub of the green in this last kind of 5 or 6 games, this period. I think he calls it 8 games, isn't he, where he kind of says the performances have been better. We've been going in the right direction. We're seeing signs we're playing better, but we just haven't had those kind of small margins that would have turned draws or even defeats into draws or even wins. And he's kind of pinpointed the West Ham game, the Bournemouth game, I think the Villa game, and I can't remember, forgive me, the kind of moments that he's drawing on there. But he clearly feels that there's a sort of a pendulum swing, and I think he kind of probably felt like he deserved that. I mean, there was a moment, wasn't the end of the press conference before the match, where I think someone, I can't remember, was it Matt Barlow from the Mail? Maybe he just sort of said, good luck. And as he was walking out, he sort of said, thanks, it would be nice to have a little bit, and I think that was just in his mind, he felt like he deserved a little bit of a bit of extra fortune.
Yeah, I think a few fans are sort of taking issue with that sort of characterization of the last 8 games. And I would say Bournemouth definitely fits that that description. I mean, heartbreaking to concede the Semenyo goal right at the end, and they easily could have scored and it just didn't go in. So that's definitely a fair one. Not sure about West Ham. I think West Ham were made to look very good by Tottenham. And yes, it was a last minute conceded winner again that they conceded. But if anything, West Ham could have scored earlier. Villa again, it was a fight back in the second half, but they could have been out of sight in the first half. So I do think I don't quite agree on the way he's sort of portraying it. But certainly last night, they were very good. And you talk about the fans, the South Stand when it was built was inspired by the Dortmund wall, wasn't it? And it is quite a thing, the South Stand, when it's in sort of full support mode. It can also be a horrible place to be for a manager when they're going up against you or for the team. But I thought you're right, they were really, really strong. I mean, the attendance still was quite low. What was it, about 52,000? So about 10,000 short of a capacity. So it's obviously, I do think some fans didn't turn up, not being particularly happy at the moment, but those who did will have fully enjoyed their evening, and so many performances really to sort of to highlight. First of all, the fact that
Tom, what did you think about the red card? Whilst we were just talking about the sort of moments of luck and things, what did you think about it? Do you think it was deserved?
No, not at all. I don't think it's a red card. I hate the way the VAR stills just make them look so bad, and you just know as soon as the referee goes to the touchline monitor, looks at it, sees the still, it's an instant red card. You just know it's going to happen. But he slipped it's not that bad. If it happened to you in a game, I honestly, I didn't think it was. I didn't think Brennan's was either. Xavi Simons was speaking after the game. He didn't speak to the English media because he did it already with the pre-match, but he spoke to German media in English anyway. And he was himself saying, I don't think it's a red card, but I didn't think mine on Van Dijk was. And that's just the way it goes. And not for me. Although it sounds like you're a little less sort of definitive.
I think it's one of those where I think in the VAR era, it's a VAR red card, isn't it? And people will disagree about whether that is right or wrong. But I think when you freeze it and you see that the foot that high on Odebear's shin, I think even he, you looked at his body language, Svensson, and I think he knew he was done for. I don't think it was necessarily, because I don't think it was a particularly dangerous tackle. When you looked at it in real time, he had the ball, he slipped, and his mistake was that he tried to kind of make up for it immediately by kind of dangling his leg out to try and get the ball back. And then, he kind of followed the ball high. But I thought he was a bit unlucky. But I think, to be honest, in the VAR era, I think that is a red.
Yeah, I mean, I think consistency-wise, it should be a red card. I just don't think those red cards should be given. So that's kind of where I'm at on that one. I think it was really important that Spurs got that second goal, though, before half-time. It really felt like Dortmund were really starting to tire in that first half. But we knew, and this will come on to what I was going to talk about, the individual performances, but we knew that Spurs, even against 10 men, would probably start to tire in the second half because it was basically the walking wounded out there. So the fact that they got that goal at the right time, and this is where Thomas, talking about the rub of the green, probably hasn't had it, albeit it's up to the team to go and make this happen. I don't think they've really sort of capitalised in those moments in games where they really need to score, but last night they did. And from then, as much as the second half, there would have been anxiety around the ground. They were relatively comfortable. And I know some fans have sort of said, he sort of parked the bus in the second half. I don't agree with that. First of all, Moani should have made it 3-0. Porro, to be fair, he was dead on his feet by the time he got to the box. And I thought he had a really good game, Porro, but he could have scored as well. And you can't complain when you're winning 2-0 at home against Dortmund, which was apparently Spurs the only team this season in the Champions League to have 4 wins at home and 4 clean sheets, which is impressive. But let's talk a bit about some of the individual performances. I don't even know where you want to start. I'd probably pick Xavi because he's done a post on Instagram since showing the extent of how swollen his ankle was from that Jared Bowen kick against West Ham. It really does look quite nasty. I know he talked about it before the game, but I thought he was everywhere. My question to you, Tom, is there a reason why he can't have that kind of freedom and impact in the Premier League?
I think that's part of it. I do think that's part of it. In the Premier League, he just has less time. He's more hassled, And I think we have seen some of his better performances in Europe this season. I think Solanke made a big difference for him, actually. I don't think this was not, peak Solanke in any way. And I think all things being equal, he probably would have maybe not started this game, Solanke. Maybe he would have done another half an hour off the bench. But I think his hold-up play is so much better than what Xavi's been playing with this season. I just felt like Xavi looked like he had almost, how can you describe this? Like a reference point almost on the pitch. He had someone who he knew would be where he was and he would be able to kind of work around him and work off him. And it wasn't that we saw lots of kind of brilliant link up between Solanke and Xavi. It wasn't really like that, although that may well develop, hopefully. I just think positionally, I think it really helped Spurs get up the pitch. There were a few times where we saw, didn't we, Tom? And you mentioned it once, where there was a sort of a huge kind of high ball that basically had snow on it. It was so high up in the air, and Solanke sort of brought it down, didn't he? And kind of like had the ball, and you just thought Richarlison wouldn't have been able to do that. Just that quality of being able to sort of tame a ball almost. Those difficult balls that are really difficult to kind of bring down. I think Solanke does that really well, and I think Xavi really enjoyed that. And he was smiling, Xavi, wasn't he? He was really enjoying it. I thought there were some lovely passes in the first half. He played a really nice one early on, a sort of inside-out ball for Porro down the right. He played a nice clip-through ball for Udogie. He should have scored. He had 3 or 4 good chances. There were a couple of ones that popped out to him in the first half. In the second half, he had that kind of weaving run where he kind of went through the crowded box and then lashed it towards the near post. You could tell he kind of really wanted a goal. And that was because I think he felt like he was playing well. I think he felt like he deserved a goal almost because he was that kind of performance. I think we've seen this sort of display maybe 2 or 3 times this season, but I'm tempted to say it was his best performance of the season. Do you agree with that, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. I want to talk a bit about Dominic Solanke. Let's just go for a quick ad break and then I'll come back to that. So Dom. So Tom, let's talk about Dom. By the time this goes out, his quotes from when we spoke to him in the mix zone yesterday will be out. So I'll talk about that in a second. But just briefly, you're talking about that ball that he controlled as a sort of failed wannabe centre forward myself. When you're watching him, it's the timing of when he backs into the defender to give him the space to be able to control it, which seems kind of simple, but he does it better than a lot of strikers, including Richarlison. And he's just a bit more powerful, isn't he? But that's something that I think he's just nailed. He's just he's sort of honed that craft over years of his career. That gives such an outlet, particularly the way that Spurs under Frank do often go long, that I think he'll be so useful. And it's also his pressing, isn't it? I think he set the tone for Xavi and Odegaard behind him. He ran himself into the ground. It was a really, really impressive performance for someone who hasn't started a game since last season. And you could tell afterwards, for the last couple of weeks, I've done my best to try and get him to talk after his cameos of late. And he said, not yet, not yet. This time he was open to it, obviously scoring and starting. And it was a really good interview, actually. He talked about how the injury itself has been one of the hardest moments of his life. Mainly because of the lack of clarity about when he'd actually come back. He did say that, he never got to the point where he was worried he wouldn't come back this season. But it was sort of just dragged on, didn't it? He obviously picked up this ankle injury in pre-season. It wasn't bad enough to keep him out in August. He actually made 3 sub-appearances, but then he went under had that what was deemed minor surgery. The hope was he'd be back in October, and yet he didn't come back until January. It was about 5 months out, and he just talked about, how difficult it was. Complicated was the way he described it. He didn't want to go into too much detail over the specifics of it, but how, coming in every day, coming to the game, so difficult not to be able to help when the team's struggling. He also talked about how the World Cup is still there for him, like in terms of motivation. He wants first and foremost to get back scoring for Tottenham, but he very much wants to get back in the fold for England, who do have a bit of a question mark over who's the backup to Harry Kane in the summer. And then finally talking about the parallels to last season, where Europe was the saving grace, and actually, even though Ange got sacked in the end, effectively kept him in the job throughout the season. There is a sort of similarity there with the way it's been going for Frank. And he said that, obviously winning the Champions League is going to be very difficult, but then so was last season in the Europa League. And it's absolutely key to have that goal and that target and to have that still alive to basically save the season, and how much he wants to basically stay fit and drive from here. But I thought he spoke really well. And what do you think? What about the England question? I know this is mainly a Tottenham. It's obviously a Tottenham podcast, but if Solanke does well, if Solanke's in the frame for England, it means he'll have done very well for Tottenham. Do you feel he has a chance there, or is it Ollie Watkins' sort of space to lose?
I think he's got a chance. I mean, people are talking about Dominic Calvert-Lewin, and Calvert-Lewin has had a great run in the last month or two, but it just shows, doesn't it? You don't need to have a really deep run to kind of to get into that spot, because actually there aren't that many players going for it. Watkins has obviously been better, but hasn't had a brilliant season. So I think it's there for him, and it's going to be. I think he's got an outside chance because there's only better than me, Tom, 1 camp left before the summer. So I think it's going to be difficult for anyone to suddenly make that kind of late run for the squad. But I think if Solanke has a good second half of the season, he's got a great chance. We should say as well that Frank's call about Tell and Solanke came off, didn't it? There was a lot of chat about that before the game, and I have to say that I thought it was always going to be the right decision. To be honest, I understand the idea that it's tough on Tell. It is, and no one wants to be dropped from a Champions League squad twice in 3 months, whatever it is. That is harsh. But ultimately, if you're the manager, you've got to pick the team you think is going to win the game. And I think, if you're picking between the two of them, and we know that Tell's been good in recent weeks, and Frank said, he would be in my starting lineup if he was available. But I think you have to go with Solanke, and I think that decision definitely paid off in the end.
Yeah, fully vindicated. I think the only question mark would be if Solanke hadn't started, then you would have gone, how this wasn't worth it. Because I think Tell has been one of his few highlights of the last few weeks, and it did feel harsh on him there. But yeah,
it was a dream scenario, wasn't it, Tom? Because in a way, he wouldn't have wanted to play Solanke for 90. You know, like the idea, I'm sure, was if we can, let's play him for an hour. So to be 2-0 up, playing against 10 men, that was ideal. You know, if Tottenham were 1-0 down, for example, then there would have been a lot of, I don't think the fans would have enjoyed Solanke going off in the 60th minute. So in a way, it all worked out. It all worked out perfectly for Frank.
Yeah, I think just back to the England questions, is I cover England quite regularly. I mean, obviously it's Kane, barring injury. And then I think it's probably just one other striker, because you've got Rashford, who'll probably be in the squad, who can play up there, even Foden if he makes the squad. So I do think it's Ollie Watkins is to lose, and he's playing better of late. But Solanke would be in a small group sort of vying for it. So it's definitely worthwhile motivation. Let's talk about a few of the other individual performances, though, because I think there was a lot of good ones last night. I mean, we could talk about Pedro Porro, who we know Frank rates as probably his best player, and I thought he was very good. And then he did a job when he moved to central midfield. When Janai Biffield came on, who, again, we'll come on to in a second. Let's just keep powder dry a bit on him for a second. What about Jed Spence? Because I think Spence has come in for a bit of criticism recently, and probably justifiably so. But this sort of 3-4-3 formation, if that's what it was, I'm not a huge tactico, but even Thomas talked about it being that afterwards. Maybe that suits the Tottenham squad quite well. And maybe that gets the best out of Spence and maybe even Udogie when he's up and running to play out there. What did you make of Jed? Gareth Bale, I mean.
Yeah, it was like the new Ryan Giggs, right? I mean, he had Jan Couto, on toast for definitely the first half. Like, Couto really didn't know what to do with Spence, because Spencer's got great feet, and he's obviously got a really good frame as well. So he's a really difficult player to sort of stop when he gets going. That combination, I mean, that 3 or 4 times in the first half, he really made a great run down the left. There was one particularly where he sort of kept going into the box, and he managed to sort of scramble a pullback in the end. And he was kind of, when we talk about the atmosphere, Spence was really part of that, I think, in the first 10, 15 minutes, because, those runs are so important to kind of get the fans going, aren't they? You have those, it's like a great shot that crashes against the crossbar. Like, everyone loves a weaving, mazy run down the flanks, and Spence was really doing that. I mean, he looked pretty comfortable there, I have to say. Like, I mean, the 3-4-3 thing is interesting, because in the first 5 or 10 minutes, it looked like a back five, didn't it? We were sort of trying to work it out. And it was very much when Dortmund had the ball, Spence was really tucking back in as a left back. But then when Spurs had the ball, he was basically playing as a left winger. So I think it was I can't get the numbers right here, but it was something like a sort of 5-4-1, and then that sort of morphed into a 3-4-3. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
something like that. It was.
I have to say, in modern football, trying to nail down a formation as a journalist, it feels kind of silly, because most people, and definitely Thomas Frank, seem to switch it up when they've got the ball and when they haven't got the ball. But yeah, that's probably what I would say. They had a 5 at the back.
And it looked to me like a 4-4-1-1 at times, with Xavi just sort of playing off Solanke, and almost like a sort of straight 4-4-2, really. Like, so it wasn't entirely clear, but on Spence particularly, I thought he had a really good game, and he needed it, by the way, because I think in the last 2 or 3 weeks he has not been at his best. I think he's taken a couple of steps backwards again for whatever reason. So it was great to see him playing like that again.
I feel like he has the physical attributes and the confidence, I suppose, to play out wide with taking players on, and that's where Gareth Bale's fans are having a bit of fun with that. But I sort of see where that kind of comes in. I don't think he's got the end product from what he's shown so far, whether it be his crossing or his shooting, to ever really be, a candidate for having his position switched like Bale once did, famously. But left wing has been the biggest problem position for Thomas Frank all season. He himself has said on a number of occasions how no one's really put their hand up for it. Wilson Odobert, in his mind, has probably been the one to sort of persevere with most. But ironically, and I was going to come on to him in a second, I actually think he has looked better off the right. Again, last night, thought he was very good. And you can see why Frank's got sort of faith in him long term. But just to stick on Spence, I mean, is there any reason not to sort of persevere with it, particularly if it's going to be this sort of flexible formation where he's not an out-and-out left winger a lot of the game? Maybe that's an option in the short term while they wait to try and find that left winger that they're looking for.
Maybe in the short term, but I still think, you need wingers who can score goals, and Tottenham need players who can score goals generally in those front positions at the moment. I don't think the answer for Tottenham to sort of, become a more attacking team is to flood their front line with sort of defenders. That they need players who have those instincts, and that even the Solanke goal last night, just kind of, is it a stretch to say that ultimately it's just someone who kind of knows where to be, and that is having someone like Spence. I mean, I don't know how many goals Spence has scored, what's his top, his top record, but you want players in those front positions who can deliver the numbers, and I think he did well last night. Could be a short-term option. Long-term, I think Spence is still an attacking fullback, I have to say.
Yeah, I thought Spence was very good last night. I mean, you could really pick so many from yesterday's performance. I touched on Porro, obviously Xavi, Solanke. I thought Archie Gray did really well in that midfield with Lucas Bergvall. I mean, did you forget it's two teenagers playing holding midfield there, as much as experiences they've got in the last few years. And there was at one moment, wasn't there, late in the game, where Ryerson, who'd come on, was just going like nuts, basically trying to fly into players, and Gray clearly had enough of it and suddenly just like held him up by his shirt. And it was quite good to see Archie sort of, I don't know, showing his authority on the pitch. Shows how much, I don't know, experience he's got under his belt. He's not going to be pushed around, and I thought he was very good. Wilson Odobert, we were just about to talk about it, weren't we? What do you think on the right? Is that something to persevere with from what we've seen in the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's difficult with Odobert, isn't it? I sort of feel like you see good things, and then you see games where he's anonymous, and we've seen flashes of Odobert and what the club must, really have seen when they signed him. And, there's clearly a player there, he's got talent, and I just want to see it more regularly. I just want to see more than just kind of the odd 20 minutes here and there. And what do you think, Tom? I if I'm honest, I slightly struggle on Odobert, because I just sort of find that if we sort of wax lyrical about how he looks fantastic, he'll then go through 2 or 3 games where he doesn't do anything, and you sort of think, well, he doesn't really deserve his place, and is he a real talent they have to stick with? Is he someone who just needs time? I mean, essentially, I sort of think he's probably the kind of player that if Tottenham have a stronger squad, they can bleed him in kind of much more gradually. And that's where he probably should be at, that he kind of gets a few starts and he gets on off the bench and he sort of rotates in and out. And maybe the fact of the matter is that Tottenham are sort of relying on someone like Odobert too heavily. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. I think I don't think the plan would have been for him to be the starting wide man, really. But Ange always talked about how he had something a bit different compared to all the other players he had, the way he was ability to beat a man, really, which again in itself I don't feel like we've seen often enough with his skill set. He's obviously had injury problems too.
Not enough.
But there is that talent there that both he and Thomas Frank have sort of talked about. And I do think on the right, his finishing's been pretty good. And his recently it was a couple of assists yesterday. Like, it's definitely something to persevere with, in lieu of anything else anyway at the moment. But whether I am convinced yet that he is the long-term solution or even a long-term player for Tottenham, I think I need to see a lot more evidence. I mean, he goes back to his former club, doesn't he, this weekend, Burnley. I'm sure we'll talk about it in a minute. Those are the kind of games in the Premier League where you want to see him really starting to impose his authority on matches. We just definitely haven't seen it enough in the Premier League. I mean, it's a similar story to Xavi. In Europe, he seems to do better where maybe it's less physical, and that's a big question mark over Odobert, isn't it? Physically, is he up to it? Not just from a robustness against injury, but just in matches. I haven't seen enough of it. But let's be positive. I think there's been a lot to give optimism from him going forward. Talking of young players, Janai Biffield, what a moment for him. He's become the youngest player in Spurs' history to play in the Champions League, coming on as a second half sub for Lucas Bergvall. Just actually on Bergvall, we did see him in the mix zone afterwards, and he didn't do an interview with us, but we did ask, you're right. Kind of shook his head a little bit. I mean, who knows what much that means, but it wasn't exactly like Conor Gallagher the other day going, I'm fine after he clashed heads. So one to watch, I guess, on Lucas, on his fitness, where he keeps coming off in games at the moment, doesn't it? I think it might have been an ankle one this time rather than a hamstring or maybe calf. But yeah, Janai Biffield, I personally thought he did everything right. He kept it simple. kept it solid, didn't put himself into any difficult positions, and got the job done. Playing out of position as well. He's a centre back. He's not a right back. What did you make of Janai?
Yeah, I think he played well. He looked very sort of calm, composed, which is all you can ask, really. I mean, he's 17. Blimey, like that is, to be thrown into that kind of game. I mean, I guess in terms of the occasion, it's a big occasion. In terms of the game state, I thought it was a good time in a way to kind of bring on a player like that. Spurs were 2-0 up, but we should say that Dortmund were pushing in the second half. We haven't really mentioned the second half where Spurs did fade, didn't they, a little bit? I don't think, as you said earlier, it wasn't fair to kind of say they were deliberately on the back foot, but I thought Thomas said afwards, didn't he? We weren't as good on the ball as we should have been, and so there was a little bit of pressure, and it could have been nervous if Dortmund had got one. They had a couple of decent positions for free kicks and things. So, Biffield wasn't going into a match where Spurs were 4-0 up and cruising home and dry. There was still some work to be done, and I thought he did everything right. And what a lift it was for the stadium, by the way. That when he came on, that just kind of that feeling that the fans were like, yes, one of our own guys, that's coming on here, a youngster we can really get behind. And there was a ball, wasn't there, that just kind of got chipped into the air. And I think his first touch was a header. And the fans just went mad for it. And there was a guy behind us. We were in the press box, and in the kind of boxes behind us, there was someone who just sort of went, yes, and clapped, I think, and it was literally like a sort of like a dad on a Sunday morning in a Sunday league game, like just seeing his boy kind of make a pass or something. It was really nice. I've got to say, I assume it was his brother or his dad or someone like that. I don't know.
Yeah, we were wondering, is that a family member? Because often behind the press box is where you often get those family members. So wouldn't be surprised. Again, he came through the mix zone afterwards with his good friend Luca Williams-Barnett, and we didn't speak to him for an interview like Lucas, but we obviously said congratulations, and the beaming smile, said everything about it. He was so proud, and he should be. But it sounds like his debut might have come quicker early this season, were it not for a broken arm, I think he had. So fair play to him. I mean, let's move it on a little bit to Burnley and Thomas Frank as well. So this was a huge result for him. Like, no doubt he was under massive pressure. By all accounts, the club were considering his future after the reaction of the supporters at West Ham. He obviously came to the press conference on Monday and the training as if there were no issues. Although he did admit that there's stormy weather out there, was how he put it, didn't he? When he talked about the lunch he'd had with Vinay Venkatesh and the chief executive, Johan Lange, the co-sporting director, and Nick Butcher, who's the son-in-law of co-owner Vivian Lewis, who I'm told is very influential at the club right now. I think had this game gone like it had done against West Ham and the reaction had been similar, he would have been on what you call a sticky wicket in particular. It already felt like he was kind of on the brink. But the thing with the brink is you can come back from it, can't you? What do you see for him now, Thomas Frank? Because as badly as it's gone in the league, and as much as Burnley away, if it goes badly, will add fuel to that, you can't deny how the Champions League has been so far for him. He's excelled, really, hasn't it, when you look at the position in the table?
I think sticky wicket is kind, Tom. I think he would have been on one of those pictures that Ange used to talk about, where there were frogs jumping out of the holes, wherever it was. I think he would have been on not even thin ice. What else can we say? Sticky wicket, thin ice, frogs jumping out of the ground. But it would have been, I think it would have been tough for him, I have to say. It's a funny one, isn't it? And I think it's one of those where when, as a club, you start going game to game, you are at the mercy of results, and that is for good and for bad. If you make your mind up based on, a broader spectrum of performances and what you're seeing from the coach and what you're hearing in the dressing room, then ultimately, that is a much easier thing to do, because when you're going on for results, you never know when there's going to be a good one around the corner, and I think Spurs are now in the position, I would say, where Frank's long-term future, let's be clear, is not secure. That it's not a matter of, okay, thank goodness they've turned a corner. He's now into the end of the season. That's not how I see it. I think that he is still very much in danger. And I think, a poor result, a poor performance against Burnley, I think throws him right back into the red zone. But of course, like last night was a good performance. The atmosphere in the stadium was really positive, as we said. And I think that has been a major concern for the Spurs hierarchy in the last few weeks. And there are certain things, if you wanted to, that you could kind of say, okay, like is this the beginning of a little bit of a turnaround? Solanke's fitness, for example, Xavi playing better, some availability, issues are going to be better at the weekend, right? And the bottom line is, can you sack a manager who's just kind of led you into the Champions League knockout stages? Like, can you sack a manager next week who, if they win against Eintracht, takes you directly into the last 16, like finishing the top 8 in the Champions League? You look at the teams in there, Real Madrid, Inter Milan, Bayern Munich, PSG, Arsenal. Like that is no mean feat. Like, that is a great achievement, for Thomas Frank, even with what has been a kind draw. I think Thomas has bought himself some time. How much time remains to be seen. How much faith, I think, remains to be seen. But I think he's bought himself at least another game. And I would say probably he'll get Eintracht as well to kind of finish the Champions League off. And some supporters, may be kind of disappointed about that. But, ultimately, the team have played better, haven't they? They didn't look like a team who was sort of, not fighting for the coach last night. They played well. The fans were behind the team. They're really well placed in Europe. I think Frank is now gonna have the rest of this week. Let's see. We're recording on Wednesday morning. Everything at the moment is kind of day by day, but that's kind of my take on it. What's your view, Tom?
My view is that they haven't wanted to do it, and if they were going to do it, they would have done it after the West Ham game, but they resisted the urge to do it then amid huge fan pressure. They were thinking about it, but they didn't do it. So after last night's result, I feel like even if they lose at Burnley, and you are right, we are going from game to game. When you think of the intro to this podcast, it goes, the Thomas Frank quote is, everything I do is for the long term. That is quite hard for him to do right now when he's going from game to game. But I feel with the position in the Champions League that you're right, definitely buys them some time. I don't know if that means, long term they're convinced and things can be different, but put it this way, I'm not expecting Sunday to be a really busy day for me. I'm off the back of the Burnley game. I still think, it's likely that it's famous last words, but I think he's in a better position.
You're just hoping that, Tom, because it's your birthday this weekend. So you're
my birthday in Frankfurt,
hoping you're going to get Sunday off.
That's true. I am hoping for that. Yeah, definitely. But I don't know. Also, they're away from home. I think they're better, aren't they? And it's not this game. Even if they lost, it's not the same. It won't be. I just don't see the scenes being as toxic as they can be at home, like they were against West Ham, away to Burnley. How many fans are going to go? Yeah, there'll be some ardent fans there, but and if if they get tonked, then maybe it could be, but it just won't have quite the same impact. So I'd be surprised, but famous last words.
I think that's a great point, Tom. I think the crucial thing there is, do the club want to look for reasons to keep Frank, or do they want to look for reasons to get rid of him? And I think they're still in the mode where they're looking for reasons to keep him, and if you went into that mindset last night, and we know a few of them were there from the board, you wouldn't have watched that game and thought, yep, there's lots of reasons here to make a really difficult decision tomorrow. You would have said, okay, there's a lot of reasons here why we can push that decision down the line and give him another chance. And I think you're absolutely right. That has been their stance all the way through this season, and particularly in the last few weeks, that we want to give Frank a proper go. That we want to be sensible owners. We want to be calm. We don't want to be twitchy like we've seen at other clubs. I've heard all these things. And ultimately, last night was a reason to kind of keep going, wasn't it? If that is their mindset, which we know it is, then last night served as confirmation bias to kind of keep him in. And ultimately, it comes back to the point we've made many times, which is when the board were discussing at the weekend, what the alternative options could be, they probably had the same sort of list that we've had, like what are the other options? What do you go to right now? And it's one thing to say, yes, maybe Frank, after that West Ham game, some people might say his position was almost untenable. But ultimately, when you're thinking, we're 10 points above the relegation zone, interim managers have not gone well for Tottenham in the last few seasons. There isn't a convincing person there who you think, we're going to immediately have a bounce. I can see why the board would look at that bottom three and that 10-point gap and look at it a little bit nervously. If you're going to put someone in with almost zero experience, let's say Heitinga, no experience of managing a team in the Premier League, some experience of managing Ajax, but it didn't go great. If that suddenly goes south, things could get worse instead of better. So it is that situation where I think they're looking for reasons to stick ultimately, and that doesn't mean that it's going to last much longer. It could well end up being a kind of last hurrah for Frank. That is very possible. Maybe this will be the night that we'll look back on and say, well, that was a nice positive towards the end, but it didn't last very much longer after that. I still think that's very possible. But he has bought himself some time at least.
Yeah, I think two things often when it comes to sacking managers is the fan pressure will definitely have an impact. Definitely when it comes to, the toxic scenes as we saw against West Ham. But I think a big part of it is if the players are still playing for them. Once the manager loses the players, it comes very, very hard to come back from that. But last night's evidence from a team that had, to be honest, every excuse not to put in a shift like they did because they were so bare-boned, as Harry would say, and likes of Xavi playing with injury. Well, they gave the complete opposite message of that. They suggested they're still fighting for the manager. So if you're in a position where you're already, as you say, looking for reasons to keep him, that would only provided, further justification for keeping him on. But it also provided justification for them to say, well, where the hell's this been all season? Why can't this happen more often, and particularly in the league? And I think that's obviously Frank's big challenge. In the press conference afterwards, that lovely line about enjoying large glasses of red wine after that, which he fully deserves after what's been a hellish, few weeks for him or longer, and after that performance. But he himself said, right, the message is we've got to build on this. We've got to take it to Burnley. And we've got to work and go from here. Just to round things up, as a little preview to Burnley, Wilson Odebear's old team, they're just as West Ham were, another claret and blue team in the relegation zone, which proved to be a really difficult and bad fixture for Spurs against an old friend in Scott Parker. This is where they really need to get back to that imperious away form and buy themselves a good sort of solid 2-0 away win, don't they?
They do, yeah, they do. And I think it's important, actually, that, you weren't in that press conference, Tom, but Thomas said a couple of times, his answer to the questions about his future were very much, this was a great night, but we need to build on this. We need to kind of capitalize. Can we turn this into something from here? And I just wonder, and this is pure speculation, it's not information at all, it's opinion. I just wonder if that lunch, I've been desperately racking my brain, like, what were they talking about? Like, how did that conversation go? Because you asked Tom in the press conference, it was a great question, did you get any assurances in that lunch meeting in the, wherever it was, Hotspur Way canteen, that this wouldn't be your last game against Dortmund? And he said, didn't he? He said, this doesn't happen in football where you get a conversation, hey, mate, if you win tomorrow, no problem. If you lose tomorrow, no problem. He said, we talked about life. We talked about football. We talked about the future of the club. And I'm just wondering, was the tone of that conversation actually quite realistic? That maybe, I cannot believe they didn't discuss, the situation around his future and all the speculation. But was actually the kind of the tone of the conversation a bit more like, Thomas, this isn't going well. We know this isn't going well, but we really want it to work. Like, we're really supporting you here. But ultimately, we need to see results. Like, we need the toxicity from the fans to kind of calm down. It's not going to be like, you have to win this game or that game. But over the next few weeks, we have to see a sort of an improvement. You understand that. We understand that. Everyone was kind of on the same page here, where everyone was sort of maybe coming to a sort of a realization that, everything has to get better. Like, we all are on the same page and we want it to work, but equally it has to get better. And I just felt like after the game, it was almost like Thomas was saying that, he was like, this was a great night. And he used the word magic at one point, the kind of energy with the supporters, but he wasn't going too hard on it because I think he knows, he's not stupid. He is aware that this is one match. It's one performance. And he knows that now, I think for himself, for the team, for his future, they have to build on it. And I just wonder actually if that's been said, that maybe it has to be something where, yeah, we'll get behind you, but we also have to see something. But I mean, that's just a guess. But I just wonder if that was kind of the tone of the conversation. But you're right. Burnley, it's an important game, not least because after that, we all know that February is a really difficult month, isn't it? That they're going into some really hard fixtures. Maybe that will suit Tottenham, the way Frank plays, a bit less pressure, but they're still difficult games. So, they need the 3 points this weekend.
They do. They've actually got quite a lot of options. Coming from this game where they've had no one available beyond the first 11. Yes, they've still got some major injuries, but Tell's back in. Gallagher is available. Bissouma, who's suddenly come back into the mix, actually played, I thought, really well against West Ham when he came off the bench. Van der Ven's back from suspension. With this formation, if he sticks with it, there are actually quite a lot of options that he can play around with. So that helps. I'm going to wrap it up now, but just one final thought. I'm obviously not expecting Johan Lange to speak to the media at this current stage. Why would he? Particularly when he hasn't before. Even though in the last few games I have tried him every time he's passed the mix zone and had been politely declined, which I'm very used to these days.
You need to tell my tactic, Tom, when they go past the mixer, and you have to say to every player, well played. Couple of minutes, and they say no, and you say, no problem, well played. And then they look at you very nicely. That's what you need. With Johan Lange, you need to say, good signings, well done.
You would have been proud. Maybe you would have been proud of me yesterday, Tom. I had 2 minuti for Vicario. I had 2 minutes for Odebert. I had 2 minutos for Pedro. Got snubbed by all of them, but we got some stuff, so I'm not complaining. But my point was going to be,
you could do a kind of mix zone Duolingo channel, Tom, where you just sort of come up with mix zone vocab in various different languages. It would be perfect.
Well, all I need is 2 minutes and well played, because that's generally what we need, really. But my point was going to be, on the other side of the mix zone was the German media, and out comes the Dortmund sporting director. I don't know, I've forgotten his name, but they speak every week, and I know it's the culture, and we just don't do it here. And long talked about it. Managers have talked about it. It's just not what we do. Even Paratici was so used to it in Italy. As soon as he has the option not to do it when he comes to England, they fully grasp that that chance to not speak. But how useful would it be for fans? We are just conduits for the fans at the heart of it, and for them to get more of an idea of the reasoning behind it all, if they did. And I'm not going to bite. Why not? But anyway, but obviously overall, really positive day. As you say, definitely not out of the woods yet, Thomas Frank. I think you've summed it up very nicely, that final answer about the state of play. But it's over to him now, as he says, to build on it at Burnley. And again, what an opportunity to start shifting the narrative. But anyway, from me, Tom Barclay, the Sun, Tom Allnutt, thanks very much, mate. And we'll speak to you after the Burnley game. Cheers, guys.
Cheerio.